Excalibur is a premium app, as Jaman had mentioned, separate installer, very similar to Insights for ArcGIS, if those that are familiar with that. So from the app launcher, Matt Calamito is licensed for Excalibur, so it's a per user-based licensing model. I have a license to it, I have access to Excalibur, and in a single click I can launch it from my portal environment, okay? Up top, the top cards, this is kind of what we would call our Connect view. It's kind of the home page, if you will, the default view. And one of the things Excalibur does is it makes it easy to search and discover imagery. One of the key areas that we heard feedback as we brought imagery to the web was, how do I search and discover select images out of my collection of imagery, right? How do I even know what imagery I have available to me? And there's a couple different ways that we allow you to search, discover, and interrogate your images. One is a traditional image service URL. So an ArcGIS image server service. I have a REST endpoint, REST services endpoint here. So these are all image services. Why? Because they have the image server extension. So at version 1 and 1.1, which comes out on Tuesday, Excalibur works solely with ArcGIS image server services with future expansion into things like WMS, WMTS. But essentially I supply a URL. So if I just grab a REST endpoint, I can copy that link. I can paste this in here. We run a validation against your image service, make sure you have access to it, A, and B, it's a true endpoint of an image server. And we can do one of two things. I'm going to call this out a couple different times to show you the UI Jaman was talking about. We want to make it easy to use and make it more muscle memory. When I see a certain color, I know what I'm doing. I'm going a certain way. So we're trying to apply some UI UX design to this application to make it easy. So you're going to hear these words, connect to canvas, blue button, connect to catalog, gray button. We'll get into what both those mean in just a second. So if I have an image service URL, I can do that. This middle one here is called My Available Imagery. As a user, I may not know what Portal for ArcGIS is. I may not care, but I just need to know what imagery I have available in my organization. To those that are Portal users, to those that understand the ArcGIS platform, if you notice up at the top on each of these cards, it's of type imagery layer. We are essentially running a filter against the content within your content and your organization's content, all these different types of item types, web maps, dashboards, feature layers, right? All we're doing is running a filter and saying, based on who you are and what you have access to, here's all the imagery layers that are available to you. Quick way to discover what is there in my organization. I can see some details about it, right? And then there's those two buttons again, connect to canvas blue, connect to catalog gray, right? That same UI design, and we'll get into what each of those means again in just a second. Up top, you'll notice it says that I have 4 imagery layers available for quick access. Jaman had mentioned at the end there this notion of user settings. This is the first example that's surfacing of that. Why I'm different than Jaman is because I may work over a specific area of interest. My tasks might change, and therefore I might require different imagery day to day, week to week, right? So up in the top, you see these gray checkboxes, right? Some of them are checked on. 4 of them actually are checked on. I'm going to uncheck 2 of them here. And what it's telling me is that my settings are now updated. So at 10.7, we introduced the notion of user settings. It's basically at the user endpoint for those that are interested, the user resources endpoint. And we're basically saving those settings so that regardless of what browser I'm on, if I log into the system, my experience will be the same because I set it that way. And now you'll notice I only have 2 saved imagery layers, right? So what does that mean, Matt? Why do we care? Well, the last aspect of search and discovery not only is a URL, not only can I just see what's available, but we have this very interactive way through our imagery catalog search. And before I get into it, down in the lower left corner is a place that I can quickly connect to or search and discover on specific imagery layers, right? And if you notice, I only have 2 down here. These are where my saved and immediate go-to are, and it's very flexible. I can click on and off to save these as my favorites and then uncheck them to no longer have them as my favorites. So that's just an example of how these user settings surface in the application. The imagery catalog search allows you to interrogate a specific collection of imagery. In this case, I'm currently interrogating my San Francisco panchromatic image service. And from here, we can start defining search setting criteria, right? Whether that's your area of interest, so we do take your current map extent, what you see here, the United States, but I can also interrogate it based on my needs. So I may have specific date ranges that I want to search against. I only want to see images with certain cloud cover, right? So we are reading in your image service, understanding what metadata it has, and allowing you then to search against it, right? And I can even add an area of interest filter here I can draw it directly on the map, and in a single click, I can run that search. And based on I don't know if you can see it down there. Yep, this one you can. The orange settings down there, that's kind of my active search summary. Now I know what actual settings are being applied to this specific filter. So I applied date ranges, cloud cover, and area of interest. Those are the ones that are in orange. I did not even ask for anything about obliquity or predicted near, so it's bringing everything back in those regards, right? And now I can take a look at that search result list. Each of these results, as I highlight, you'll notice the corresponding footprints being highlighted in the image. I can start selecting specific images, and I can start interrogating this in what we would traditionally call our map space, right? So we're taking the image, it's being orthorectified on the fly by the power of the image server. In stream, this is a full resolution image based on the pixels in my current view. This is not just a thumbnail. So I can truly gain an understanding of this image specifically in what we would call map space, the geospatial view of things. I can look at the metadata of the image, right? To gain an understanding, I can start interrogating each of the metadata, the data about the data. And then there is an actual thumbnail of that image if I was interested. The great thing about this application is I can stay in my search experience to also view that same image dynamically in its native perspective. If you noticed, as soon as I close out of this preview window, those buildings look like they were falling out of the sky. Why? Because we were taking that oblique image and we were trying to fit it to a 2D map. Well, for those that work with imagery, specifically oblique, this looks a lot better and allows me to understand and analyze the image based on how it was collected off the sensor at a specific angle. So again, this is a full resolution image. I can rotate the image. I can view the metadata from this current view as well. So I did say we interrogate your metadata. Let's just switch real quick to a different image service. As soon as I select that, you'll notice my search results are cleared. We zoom out to the extent of the image service. So we interrogate that image service and say, based on the default extent, we know that image is around this area. If I go to my search settings, you will notice I don't have any additional metadata to search against. All I can do is define an area of interest. Why? Because some of the metadata is not available in this specific type of image service. So if I just draw a quick AO over this area and I go to my search results and I take a look at the metadata here, I don't have much metadata, right? So it really depends on what type of image service you've published, and the app experience will come to light based on those types of services. So let's select a couple image services here around a specific area. Maybe I'm tasked with highlighting key areas of activity, right? So I can select multiple images. As I select them, we're now moving to what we would call our queued images tab. This basically says I've interrogated a whole image collection, or what we would refer to as our image services. From that image service, I basically want 1, 2, 3, 10 images out of that collection. So now in a quick, easy way, when we talk image management, a lot of folks look at this and had trouble saying, how do I just pick 1 or 2 images from my image service? This is a way now to interrogate those and bring those to the forefront. At the bottom here, we could do one of 2 things. I can now take those 2 images that I know I can identify areas over this key port of interest, right? And I can either create a new project or connect to the canvas. There's that blue button again, connect to canvas. So this is the catalog experience. This is how I search and discover imagery. Once I find those images or image of interest, I can then connect to the canvas. This is where your exploitation, your use, your work with the image begins. So we didn't leave the application. We didn't download images locally. We are still streaming in services and then working with those selected images. So for those that are familiar with some of our raster functions, we're basically doing a lock raster on these specific images out of that image service collection. And now we're in our canvas view. Again, this is where we work with our images. So we have a set of tools, both display tools that I can work with the pixels, pixel manipulation, and then exploitation tools, things I can do like marking up or annotating on top of the image, very PowerPoint-like. Mensurations, measurements, 2D, 3D measurements based on the metadata. And then lastly, being able to disseminate out what I'm doing with my image to certain things like PowerPoints and whatnot. Down here, we have our image metadata table. One interesting thing that we can do, as Jaman had mentioned, is this notion of side-by-side view. Taking a specific image, and as I zoom in on one side, you're going to notice the other side is also zooming in, right? Our current extents are what we would call locked. On the left-hand side is your traditional geospatial view. Just to kind of get that point across, we're orthorectifying that oblique image to try to fit it onto that map, right? And you can see that we're doing that here. Well, on the right-hand side, this oblique image is the way in which I may want to view it. It was how it was captured off the sensor. So as a user, I may not care about the map space, and I only want to work with the image in its traditional way. So I'm going to start taking some of our display tools to step you through. So Jaman had mentioned you may not need to understand a lot about being a true trained analyst on the imagery side, but we have simple tools to quickly apply things like DRA and gamma, and this should light up here if it didn't get washed out on the projector. As we're applying in-stream to those pixels, those dynamic range adjustments and those gamma functions or display methods to this image. I can also in-stream make this multispectral image back to a panchromatic by changing those band combinations, right? All on the fly, so all of us here could be looking at the same image. The power of the image server is it's one image on disk, and each of us has our own view of the image based on how we're manipulating those pixels. Very, very powerful for those that aren't using the image server. I can reset that back to look at this in 3-band here. If we had renderers, which we'll get into in just a minute, I can apply those. Enhancements for those that do care about changing your resampling methods, different stretch methods. Maybe I don't want min-max, I want percent clip or standard deviation. Applying filters like pan sharpening, line detection, smoothing, right? So we do have these operations that are coming from the image service that are available that I could do, again, in-stream in the browser dynamically. So maybe as a user, I need to call out key areas of activity at this port. I do see some cargo loading occurring at this port. So I can use in very PowerPoint-like fashion, I can start annotating on top of my image. In this case, maybe I want to call out these key areas of activity occurring. I want to add a text label. We'll call this cargo loading, and maybe I want my font size to be a little bit bigger. And I can add that text label. And then maybe I'll just kind of connect that to further highlight or call out this area of activity, right? So just simple, easy ways, changing color, changing shapes. How do I annotate on top of my image to highlight or call out something of interest? We also have the opportunity to produce measurements or mensurations. Again, this is dependent on your metadata, and the accuracy of these measurements will depend on if your image service is also tied to an elevation service, right? So in addition to your RPCs or your actual sensor model on the image, the metadata coming in, and how that image service was published against an elevation service will be more accurate, right? And then lastly, on this kind of ad hoc way, I can export my kind of findings, if I will, down to a PowerPoint presentation where maybe this will have to go to a briefing. I want to put this in my organization's templates, right? So in just a couple clicks here, we'll call this cargo loading at port, and I can quickly create a PowerPoint presentation. What this does, it's going to dump my current view into a PowerPoint and take the metadata from the image and throw it into the notes section of the PowerPoint. This is where we, right now it's very simple at version 1.0.1.1, but now I can cut and paste this and place this in my organization's templates. We had talked about the notion of user settings, right? As we see this application grow, another area of user settings we like to have is I have a template that's different than your template, that's different than another person's template. Being able to kind of download this PowerPoint into my own template, I think would be a very good, useful workflow, defining the size of maybe that export, right? So we see a lot of growth here in certain areas of that. So that's kind of the ad hoc workflow there. I know I want to show the pre-planned workflow, then leave room for some questions. So again, what we did there, we searched and discovered through many different ways, right? I can apply an image service and I can connect to the catalog, right? That's that whole image management, search and discover, interrogate that collection of imagery, or connect directly to the canvas where I work with it, right? So we can do that through a URL. I can see what imagery I have available to me based on these cards here. This is the imagery layers that I have access to. And then lastly, we went to our imagery catalog and we interrogated specific image services. So many different ways I can begin finding imagery in my organization. The last thing I wanted to show before I switch to the other workflow is in my available imagery. Who here has heard of the Landsat views, the available image services? Anyone familiar with those, Landsat? All right. So we're going to connect directly to 888,000 plus images in our Canvas view. This is a service that's available online if you want to start testing with some image services. Why I'm connecting to this specific one is a couple different things. A, to show you basically in stream how quickly something can be applied to this large of a data set. And And also, because when I go to my image display tools, you'll notice I don't have any band combinations. I don't have things going on. Why? Because this service is already predefined with what we would call renderers. So whoever published this image service applied what are raster functions in a raster chain, allowing me to easily, as a user, may not know anything about that, but I can start changing this image dynamically in the browser. Right now I'm looking at agriculture with DRA, and in just a single click I could change this to color infrared. This is going to basically call and change all these pixels in stream so that I'm viewing this same type of imagery, single image on disk, in many different ways based on those renderers being applied. And maybe this time we'll also just look at bathymetric here, right? Just showing you another example of how quickly these things change. Lastly, if I change this back to user-defined, that's the ability where then I can change these band combinations because nothing was predefined for me. So just another example of how we can start using some of these tools to really interrogate imagery. All right, the last next workflow we're going to go over is the imagery project workflow. This is that pre-planned workflow. Jaman had talked about new item type, right? So let me just switch back over to the portal real quick. At 10.7, why 10.7 is required for Excalibur is this new imagery project item type. It's a new item type in the system. If you're a user that initially creates a new imagery project, which can be done through Excalibur, we create a new folder in your content called the Excalibur Imagery Projects. And if you'll notice, there's the new item type, right? It's called the Excalibur Imagery Project. The logo that you'll start seeing of this item type as I open this looks like basically a toolbox with some rasters there, right? So you'll start seeing this come to life at 10.7. I can open these things directly from my content into Excalibur if I desire, or using Excalibur, I can simply take a look at existing imagery projects that I, as a user, have access to. These are projects that are shared to a group in which I am a part of. And I can start seeing interesting things about these imagery projects, right? So I can start filtering them dynamically based on what I'm looking for. I can see a name about the project, a brief description, who created it, when was it created, and then ultimately what type of project it is. At version 1.0 and 1.1, we tackled two different project types. One of the key ones is called an observation imagery project. Why are observation imagery projects or imagery project types important? Because they surface specific tools and workflows to allow the user to stay more focused. It provides them with a streamlined experience. So instead of just talking about it, let's open up one of these and we'll take a closer look at them. So here we are. We just talked about this canvas view. This is where I work with the imagery. So you're going to notice a couple different things, right? My base map's different. I have what we would call vector content overlaid on top of the image, right? If I now open my tools menu, I have a whole new set of tools called project tools. Why? I opened up an imagery project. I didn't just open up an imagery project, it was an observation imagery project. And now I have a set of observation tools. So as we start to release more imagery project types, these specific tools will focus and surface to the user. Different experience than something like a desktop application where I have tools everywhere and I find it. We're bringing the tools to you based on the project type you just opened up. Every project, regardless of the type, will have a set of instructions. It tells the analyst, the user, what they need to accomplish in this specific project, right? And in this case, I might be identifying areas of active construction taking place within a defined area of interest. Cool, now I don't need to figure out what I'm trying to do. I also don't need to find the data. Overlaid on here is reference layers. These are just feature services that are available in my organization. They can be interacted with. I can toggle them on or off, right? These are layers. Now I'm not searching for data. I'm not questioning what I'm doing. It's all here, and as a user, I can begin to get to work. So that's kind of the core concept of these imagery projects. We have time sliders available specifically on your project layers. Here are my observation types, right? So as I start moving these, it's just a simple time slider. It's allowing me to see previous observations that were collected in the same area to provide me with further context. Now, knowing that my task at hand is to collect and record observations based on active construction, I'm going to place one of my images in what we would call, again, our focus view, and I can start collecting information. I do see here, I can use some of my observation tools to start collecting these observations. I do see some new construction in this image that hasn't been captured. And as I brought up my observation tools, you'll notice these is a palette of icons based on the observation type. And in this case, our activity status of construction. So once I've identified in my image the actual status of construction, in this case I'm looking for active construction, I can click on that corresponding icon and start clicking on the components here, the components of active construction. And as you notice, it's collecting both in image and in map space, right? And I can turn the image off on the other side if I wanted to further show that. A form now displays allow me to put immediate information or contextual information into these observations. So we'll just say that this is active construction on block. Domains, drop downs that you have in these layers, they could be your layers based on what you're collecting, are supported here in this view, right? So maybe this is some commercial construction. But in addition to these manual fields, Excalibur is something to help automate a lot of these observation-based workflows to allow your organizations to perform what we would call traceability. It's allowing us to then tie the observation directly to an image. So therefore, those observations I just collected are tied to this specific image. Within this specific imagery project we just opened up, they were each collected at a specific date, time, a specific location by a specific user, me, all the way down to a specific map scale. So now, as an organization, I can practically recreate the environment in which these observations were originally collected. So I'm not asking why the observation was made when it was. Why did somebody make that call? I can now be zoomed at the level that they were to try to gain an understanding of the environment in which they collected that observation. When all the information's input, I can then just submit those to be written to the system of record. They become readily available now for anyone in my organization to leverage in downstream analysis. So Jumana had mentioned image-derived products. Content created in Excalibur can now be used downstream in analysis, right? So I have an operations dashboard here. I just collected about 30 seconds ago 3 new observations. Guess what just showed up in my ops dashboard, right? So now I can click on any one of these and start interrogating. So the concept here is the content created in Excalibur can now be used immediately for others. I may be a supervisor. There may be numerous analysts working on those imagery projects. And now as a supervisor, I want to see all observations that are taking place in my organization to gain a holistic approach. Different application, different kind of use case, but still, these are observations that were collected in Excalibur that I'm now throwing in Insights. Anybody familiar with Insights here? Have they used it? Cool. It's a way to interrogate your data, see patterns you didn't know existed. What days of the week were these observations? Maybe I'm doing performance metrics. Which one of my analysts are collecting most at what times, right? So I can start interacting with some of this data that's being collected to really drive downstream analysis and analytics. So we do see imagery projects growing. Jumana will get into it in just a little bit of different types of applications that we see fit. But as you're sitting here over the next couple minutes, 10, 15 minutes, think of certain workflows that you could help automate for your organization. We'd love to hear that feedback to gain an understanding of it. So I got a couple more minutes here before we switch to some final words and QA, QC. But we saw the end result of what an imagery project is. How are these things created and how easily can they be created? So in Excalibur, we have a notion of a guided workflow. This allows you to create these imagery project item types to keep you in the application, to create new layers, to collect observations, right? So let's quickly step through how to create one of these. At the basis of all imagery projects is imagery. So we as Excalibur need to understand what images of interest are you trying to then have a pre-planned workflow designed around. So let's use our San Francisco imagery here. It's got some nice oblique imagery. In the sake of time, let's just run a search. We'll grab a couple images, and instead of connecting to Canvas, we're going to create a new imagery project. At version 1.0 and 1.1, we have 2 imagery projects, a base imagery project. Very simple. I have a set of images, and I want an analyst to take a look at them. Nothing else is required. They may just need to mark up, they may need to mensurate, and that's all they need to do. Cool, I can set that up for them and let them go to work. Or an observation imagery project allows me to collect content to store into the system of record as we just saw. So let's create one of these observation projects so that we can see how easy it is to do. First, we need to define project details. Since this is a new item type, all items in the portal require a title, a tag, and a summary, right? Well, this is what is required from your imagery project. Tell us about it, right? So this will be the San Fran UC 2019 project. And for the sake of time, we'll say that that's what our summary is. Projects, we're going to collect observations on automobiles and let's just say trees. And we'll build a new layer about trees. So we'll say trees and automobiles as our tags. I'll share this to my organization. And then we'll go to the next step. So in the previous example, I showed you clicking on contextual layers and we were able to view the pop-ups very quickly. That was because we chose a web map that had existing reference layers. So in this case, let's just pick another web map that I know is around the San Francisco area. It has existing feature services in there, and we'll just add that to my project. Next here, this is where the real glory of Excalibur is. I can do one of two things. I can select an existing observation layer, so a layer in your organization that you want us to start collecting observations on. So we'll do this one first go around. And in this instance, we're going to collect on automobiles. So I'm going to add that automobile layer to my project, and I want to add another one, and this time we're going to create a brand new one. We're going to create a new trees layer. That's what we had said we're going to collect on, right? So these are the tree ops. They're going to be points, and these are trees as the tags, right? So I'm literally creating a new dynamic feature service all within Excalibur. Here's where it's we're asking you what fields do you want to collect on. Right now we're giving you a comments field by default. You can free text anything in there. Well, as a user, I want them to collect on tree types, right? So I'm going to start creating what we would call domains, values, some call them pick lists, right? So let's name some trees out there. We got a spruce tree, right? We'll just throw a couple in here. There could be an oak tree. And lastly, we'll do something like a maple tree, right? So these are all my coded domains. Think of these as the palette of icons that may display for my user. So maybe that's all I want them to collect on. I'll give them a free text of comments, and they're going to collect on the types of trees they see. Next, we're going to now define the palette of icons that gets displayed when they click on that tool. So for spruces, I want them to have, I don't know, red squares, and for maples, they're going to be green diamonds, and oaks, you're going to be triangles that are orange. Great, so now I'm defining this palette here. Lastly, since this is a new layer, we now need to just quickly create that. So this is going to spin up. It's going to tell you, hey, give it a second. We're going to create a new hosted feature service for you on the portal. And we'll go back to our portal here. So again, I didn't go into ArcGIS Pro. I'm not creating a new feature file geodatabase, a new feature class. I'm not doing this thing called domains, right? I'm kind of staying in Excalibur. But there's my new trees layer. It was just created here on July 10th, right? If I go back to Excalibur, it tells me that my trees layer has now been created. I now added 2 observation layers to my project. And now I'm at my project summary. What did we just do? We're creating a new San Fran UC 2019 project. It's of type observation. We're collecting observations in automobiles. It's using an existing web map called San Francisco, and we have 2 observation layers in it. I'm going to hit create. This is going to take a second. It's going to create that new imagery project. And now immediately within my environment, I'm going to open this project up. So as that creation process, I just may be a supervisor, right, a team lead, and I want to create this thing for a user who can just open it up. They don't have to worry about anything we just did. But let's just verify the things that we had. We wanted them to collect on automobiles and trees, right? There's our project instructions. And if we take a look at our observations, there's that new trees observation layer, right? It's now defined based on the domains I just created. And there's also the existing automobiles layer. So that was just a quick example before we get into some of the remaining slides of this pre-planned workflow. We showed you the end result. We showed those observations in downstream analysis. And then we just created one of these new things here in ArcGIS Excalibur. And just to confirm that, if I go back to my projects list, there's that new item that we just created of an imagery project. So I'll send it back over to Jaman here to kind of tie the final loop.